raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bottle said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age. Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross-Tyme Pub, working late, after hours, after dark, here as we continue our pursuit of answers to the mysteries of time and space, as all those fine archaeologists out there in our listening audience tend to do. And, of course, my cohorts here in the Cross-Tyme Pub, Jason Pentrail and James Waldo. Jason, what's on your mind this week?
Hey, well, we're kicking off a brand new year, so I'm excited for the upcoming new additions that we have to the podcast. But yeah, I'm settled into the new studio as we discussed last time, and everything's on track, so feeling good.
Everything's on track. Well, that's good. This sounds like a financial podcast all of a sudden now. Hey, James, how are you doing there, friend?
Great, and not giving investing advice like Jason is. 2021, I'm ready to get it started. Let's get off to a good start, and I think we've got some good things lined up for this year for the listeners, and I think it's going to be a good time for everybody.
Well, certainly. You know, it's been a bit of a rough start, I think, for everyone here with 2021. I saw a meme the other day of a gentleman leaping on a beach. He's airborne, and he is frolicking joyously as he exits the dumpster fire that was 2020, and he leaps victoriously into 2021, but then there's this German Shepherd with its teeth bared, and it's leaping right toward his crotch. Yeah, I thought that's a good thing to keep in mind, because you never know what the future may hold. And I think that's one reason we study the past, isn't it, guys? You learn from the past so that, well, I don't know that you can necessarily prevent the eventuality of the kinds of things that archaeology teaches us about the past, but you can certainly learn how better maybe to cope with them, and also how future problems can be dealt with as people in the past did.
Yeah, it's looking back is a good way to look forward and avoid dog bites.
Certainly is.
Yeah, amongst other things. I mean, by no means this is, not humanity's first go around with this type of thing, but it's televised a lot more. So obviously there's more to consider. But however, 2021, you just got to keep plugging away. You got to keep working. You got to keep putting out new and exciting content. And I think that's what we're going to do this year. So I'm pretty excited to announce some of the new changes we have coming up to the show.
Why don't you announce them, friend?
Well, if you remember back to 2020, we did bring out the Legacy series. That was a lot of fun and gave us an opportunity to do something a little bit different. And as we move into 2021, we want to make sure to let the listeners know that we have a couple of new series coming up that we're going to, one of which we're going to introduce here this evening, 7 Ages After Dark. And that's going to give us an opportunity to delve into a little bit wider range of topics, a little bit darker, a little more esoteric, but still based in our firm holdings with archaeology and good scholarly research. But I think it's something that'll be a lot of fun and just kind of mix things up a little bit for everyone, and hopefully bring a new perspective to the listeners.
New perspectives, that's always great. Plus, I always love the history of that idea. New perspectives in archaeology, and Louis Benford, as he kind of moved us into a new era. New perspectives are always good. And, of course, as we will be discussing the Archaeology of Magic a little later, with Dr. Augé, who was kind enough to discuss her work and really some of the most unique work in that area. We'll have more about that a bit later, although I think we also have some updates from listeners in the form of those reviews, which, of course, continue to make our world go round. Jason, I hope they have nice things to say about us.
Well, so far, so good. So again, we're off to a great start for 2021 with the reviews. We were trying to get to 50 reviews before the end of the year, but we got close. We're at 40. So again, we encourage everyone to please get out there and rate, review the show. That helps us immensely to let other people know about the show. So if you could just take a moment and do that for us, we would greatly appreciate it. But this week, we do have several new reviews. So 5-star review from Dave of Debt, who says, great stuff, interesting, informative, entertaining, great interviews. We have Mike Bash, who says, new favorite, got turned onto this podcast from a colleague/friend. I've listened to about 9 hours of the podcast in this last week, and I can't get enough. Great conversations on some really intriguing topics. I look forward to the future episodes. Cheers, gentlemen. Another 5-star review from Nothing Sticks, 7AJ's, best podcast out there for well-produced information on American archaeology. MTCSR, archaeological info for all of us. Micah and the guys are very knowledgeable and explain things to the listener. I am an armchair archaeologist, and I love this podcast. We have Pally Paint with a 5-star review, says, great podcast, one of my absolute favorites, very knowledgeable hosts and guests, very interesting content. If you have the slightest interest in archaeology, history, geology, give it a try. You will not be disappointed. We have several others, including one from Swamp Merchant with a 5-star, and then also Brian from Indianapolis with a 5-star, who says, great show, thoughtful commentary on a variety of archaeological topics, good chemistry between the hosts, and overall good work. Keep up the good work. So thanks to everyone who took a minute to drop those reviews for us. It's greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. Let me pontificate for a moment. I don't want to take too much time because we've got a big interview to get into and also a check-in from a friend and a sponsor, in fact. But archaeology is a fantastic experience, and it is something that is very accessible to people. In fact, I would highly recommend, if you are interested at all in the kind of topics we discuss on this program, look into, once it's safe to do so, the pandemic again has made this difficult also, but look into the possibility of volunteering on archaeological sites near where you live, or visit the museums. You might even be able to volunteer in some capacity there. Learning about history and learning about archaeology are great ways to immerse yourselves in really the building, the growing body of knowledge about who we are, where we come from, where we've been, and yet again, those things all tell us something about where we're headed. And that's one thing we all love. I know the guys and I. When we get out there on the road and we are visiting these sites, you know it. I know both of you know it. There is this feeling, whether we're talking with an expert like J.M. Adavasio, or whether we are going to a site like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter, or visiting the Topper site, or any other location that we visited, there is this incredible, almost magic, really, very in keeping with what we'll be discussing on this show. There's a magic. You feel it in the air. You feel it at those sites. You can't really put a finger on it, but when you go to these locations, it's unlike anything else you'll experience. I wish I could give that gift, that same magic, to everybody out there who listens to this show, but we try to convey a little of that on the podcast. And so it means a lot when we hear from you guys, and if you do like the program, if some of that magic comes across to you, across the microphone, across the airwaves, and you're able to take a little of that home, consider leaving a review or tell people about the show if you enjoy what you hear on this program. And, of course, you can always write to us like Aaron did recently. He writes and says, hey, guys, fantastic podcast. Since recently finding it, I've been listening about 6 hours a day, trying to catch up. That's a lot. He says, forgive me if you have visited this location or spoke about it already. It's very possible that you have, due to me only being on episode number 16. There's a location close to me called Fort Mountain State Park in Murray County, Georgia. I think you guys would really find it intriguing, as I have. I live about 2.5 hours away from Asheville, a little town called Blue Ridge, Georgia. And so a lot of topics you discuss and places you visit are fairly close. He says we have tons of archaeological sites in this area that rarely get studied. And he also says he has a collection of lithic artifacts and pottery from surface collections, he says, from legally collected areas and plowed fields on private property that he has gotten with permission. And so he says if you guys would ever like to see them, or I could send photos, he'd be happy to do that. But again, I really appreciate you taking time to write, Aaron, and also emphasizing the fact that he, like many folks out there that listen, he participates. He does so in accordance with the laws where he lives, and he is involved in learning about the history and the archaeology of his surroundings. That's really important. So thank you again, Aaron, for writing. Anybody else who wants to send along an email, you can reach us, Micah, Jason, or James at 7ages.org. We're always happy to hear from you guys, and we're also happy to hear from a friend of the program right now, a fellow who Jason and I have had the pleasure of spending some time with over the years. And in fact, I'm sure in the years to come, we're going to even have more adventures with him. But he also has become a recent sponsor of this program. Look, it's hard work. It's often a labor of love. And we pour effort and energy into the 7 Ages podcast. And so it's very meaningful when we have friends who say, how can I support what you do? And that's certainly what the gentleman who joins us right now is all about. And of course, he also shares our passion for history. And that is none other than Chase Pipes of the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. Chase, I just got to say one thing, man. History rocks. Woo!
Woo-hoo! It does rock, man.
It really does, man. And again, I just want to thank you also for the support you show for what we do. As much as we love you and everything that you do, man, I mean, it's one of those fantastic relationships where you have proven to be invaluable to what we do, and we can't thank you enough. And again, we wanted to have you on for a minute just to kind of talk about the work that you do and the effort toward educating people. This is something you always talk about. It's like, we're in the 21st century. We don't want to ever forget the past. We want to educate people about it and how and why they should be interested, why they should be excited about history. I don't think I know anybody who is more excited about history than you are, man.
Well, I mean, here's the thing. How can you not get excited about history? I mean, there's something that's unfathomably awesome about going to a place and knowing everything that happened there. And, I mean, we're doing the same thing in the Relic Room that you guys are doing. We are trying to educate the public. We're at a point in human history where, our progress is destroying so many sites, and there's so many things to get interested in. What the history of North America is incredible, and we need a new generation to be excited about that history. So, what we do at the Relic Room is like what you guys do. Education is first. That's why we've got our educational arm, with the Chasing History, the YouTube channel, and the podcast, which you guys met us through. But we've got a store in East Tennessee, inside of Smoky Mountain Knife Works, and what we do is we offer relics, fossils, and minerals to people as cheap as we possibly can. Good quality stuff for a really good price, because it's our philosophy. There's only so many things that a museum can hold. Museums cannot hold every artifact ever found, every fossil ever discovered, and every crystal that ever grew. It's just, there's too much of it. So somebody has to take on the responsibility of taking care of the things in humanity's past and in our natural history, in order that they be passed down from generation to generation, but that also that history, that story that artifact can tell, gets preserved as well. And so we offer, the public the opportunity to purchase relics. And what we do is we take a percentage of our showroom sales and we put it into our Chasing History program and our YouTube channels that we do, our podcasts that we have. And we're starting to fund archaeology. This is what we've worked on for years to get to. We're finally at a point where our business has grown so much where we can actually start funding archaeological digs, and that's something really excited that we hope to unveil in 2022. So yeah, that's it. We're all passionate about it, man.
Absolutely. When Jason and I were there on site, some of the fantastic archaeologists who were there, and they very much appreciate, the work that you guys do to try and support their efforts. The interdisciplinary scholars, really, history, archaeology, geology, and everything, who benefit from what you guys provide. Also books, again, I am a bibliophile, and you guys have so many wonderful books there in the Relic Room that you offer. A classic, very hard to find volumes. I actually got a couple from you. And newspapers, things like that. Anyone who can see me in my studio, on the wall behind me, I actually have old newspapers literally hanging on the walls. I love all of that. And again, it's so important to expose people to the past and to let them know how to find, good resource materials if it comes to history and historical research, and also, how to learn about these other areas of science, geology, archaeology, and what have you. And so, again, there's a little something for everybody, I think, there at the Relic Room. I know Jason would agree, and Jason, of course, and I have spent a little time there, and plus it's just a beautiful place. You feel like you're in a canyon when you go there. It's incredible.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we're located inside of Smoky Mountain Knife Works. It's a 110,000 square foot store. So, I mean, and there's 2 creeks and a waterfall going through it. I've got dinosaurs in the creek. I mean, it's epic. It's worth just to come check it out. But, the Relic Room is the largest diversity of history for sale anywhere in North America. We've got fossils from every single period of history. We get the opportunity, like, the old books you were talking about, we have, there are people that back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, were hobbyist collectors. They walked the farmers' fields, they picked up, projectile points, they pass on, and the kids don't know what to do with it. So, us old timer has had all these books and all these artifacts and relics. And so what we do is we get as much of information as we possibly can about where the artifacts were found, what county, what site. We put that information with it, the source, the book material that they have, and we find good homes for it. We put it out in our showroom and our floor so that people have the opportunity to take those relics and pass them down to the next generation.
Yeah, and that's a key important part of what you guys do there. And I also want to ask you this, Chase, for a moment, just tell the audience how many days a year you spend on the road actually visiting the sites, especially for the dinosaur bones and the fossils, to ensure that they are being collected legally and being obtained in a way that is ethical, and then before they're being brought back and sold. So how many days a year do you actually spend out there checking the sources, making sure that everything is legitimate and legal?
Probably 4 months total, spread across the whole year. So, that's a big thing that's really important to us as well, is making sure that everything that we have at the shop is legal to own. The fossils that are collected were collected responsibly and ethically. We work with, for the fossils, for example, there's about 30 people in the United States that dig fossils for commercial sale. But these 30 people are they work so closely with institutions and with the scientific community to ensure that if specimens that are found, if they need to go to science, if they need to be studied, that they get there, because that's what they hope to happen. They hope to find something that's going to change science, that's going to add something to our understanding of the past. So, that's one thing that's important to them, and it's important to us. And we go on to these sites so that we meet the landowners, and so that we talk to them, that we know that the fossils that we are collecting are legal, that there is permission that has been given, and that everything's done right. Same thing with the antiquities that we sell and the crystals that we sell, making sure that they are good to go, that they are legal within, for someone to own once they get it from us. The legal, I spend more of my time making sure everything we've got's right than I do just about anything else. Because, it's hugely, hugely important, because, it's all about doing the right thing, and it's all about, furthering our knowledge.
Chase, I got a question about the dinosaur bones. I think I saw some of your Facebook posts earlier in the year when you were, out west doing that, and I've been out there quite a bit myself, and I was wondering, is that the Morrison Formation where some of those excavations were going on?
Yeah, that's one of the formations, and that's a fun formation. You got to take a Geiger counter with you on that formation, because some of those bones are radioactive.
That's true.
And I actually, when I do pick up fossils from that formation, I swipe them with a Geiger counter to make sure that they're not too radioactive and that they're safe for people to handle. So, and we have radioactive, and they also glow under UV light. So the radioactive glow-in-the-dark dinosaur bones that we have at the Relic Room.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, we're very happy to have the Relic Room on as a sponsor for the show for all of 2021, and that is therelicroom.com. But there is another aspect to what you do, the Chasing History YouTube channel and the Chasing History podcast. So while you're out there on the road, excavating these dinosaur bones, dealing with the people who are actually part of the teams that are extracting these artifacts and dinosaur bones and minerals, crystals, all the things that you're involved with at the Relic Room, you're documenting this and you're putting it out there for people to learn and to see exactly what you do. So speak for a moment about Chasing History podcast and YouTube channel.
Well, like I said, the Chasing History is the educational arm of the Relic Room. See, I originally wanted to be a college-level history professor, but I never figured out how to add and subtract letters. So, I went into buying and selling fossils and artifacts and stuff like that. But I still want to be a teacher. So, we were going out and collecting these fossils, from these sites with incredibly knowledgeable people. So we took the camera and we started our YouTube series, Chasing History, where we do documentary style interviews with the men and women who are out in the field discovering this history, showing the audience, showing regular people how this stuff is discovered, and that's hugely important to us because, that allows, you can't go on to network TV and really see how this stuff is done and know the ins and outs of it. There's just no other shows out there like that that's showing you how history is really discovered. And that's what we do. We go out there and we document it, and we do something different all the time. The last one we just had out was on the only national monument that's ever been rescinded. It was created and then it was rescinded due to fossil theft. And so we did an interview with a friend of ours who's curator of the Texas Through Time Museum, who did a site survey out there for the BLM and go into why that national monument was rescinded. We've got a great interview with David Dean, who does archaeological work for the state of Tennessee, where we educate the public on how prehistoric Native American sites are discovered by archaeologists and the work that they do in order to record materials that are there. David was doing a site survey for the not for the University of Tennessee, but for Tennessee Valley Authority. So we tagged along with him to get to understand that. We've got a great series on how to properly excavate and document finding dinosaur fossils, how these guys use site maps to map in all of these fossils, where they're located, where in the flow they're located, so they can try to understand the direction of the current of this ancient riverbed. I mean, we try to get technical without being over everybody's heads. But it's a great opportunity that we have to educate people on, how history is discovered. And so we jump on it, we take it, because that's really what I really want to be doing with my life, is I want to be out documenting stuff instead of, at the shop, putting stuff out on the shelf. The podcast is the exact same thing, where, we go out and we'll interview, people in the same genre, archaeologists, paleontologists, geologists, monthly, and we talk about what they have going on, how stuff is discovered. And it's really the main source of the podcast is it's once a week I do a live on air 10 to 15 minute history segment on our local radio station. So it's me and two other radio DJs, and we talk about history for 10 or 15 minutes. It's a great way to start your day. It's just something neat about history. Today we did one today, and it was about, how roads got formed, in North America, starting in prehistory, from the animal trails to the Native American roads to, the first settlers and pioneers, and got all into it. So it's just a great little opportunity that we have to educate our local listening area about, history that they normally wouldn't have the opportunity to listen to.
Yeah, that's so important. That outreach side of it. I know when I was a kid, the first time I heard a cello, I think that was really one of those moments where I realized I wanted to be a musician for the rest of my life, and I still am today, even though I never ended up playing the cello. But the point is, expose people to things, especially young audiences. Get them interested in something, and I know that's a lot of what you do too. Chase, listen, again, we can't thank you enough for what you do for us. We hope to get back over there across the mountain to visit you again soon. And of course, throughout the year, we're going to have you back on the show again to check in periodically. Where can people find you online and learn more about you and what you do?
If people want to find us, I wanted to add just one more quick thing, if
Please.
I could. What you were saying about being inspired, and that's at the heart of what we're trying to do. Because when you hold or touch that artifact for the first time, or you hold that fossil, or you look at that crystal, that is going to inspire you in a way that no movie, no book, no TV show can ever do. And that's what we're trying to do, is to give as many people as possible that moment of inspiration, so that they will go and either pursue a career in science or will learn more about it. Because God knows we need more scientifically minded people, here in the 21st century, and especially in the United States. So that's what we're really trying to do, is inspire the next generation of scientists. If people want to find out what we're doing or see what we're about, you can go onto YouTube and just type in Chasing History. If you want to listen to our podcast, It's wherever you get your podcast. It's called Chasing History Radio. If you want to come visit us, if you're ever in the Sevierville, East Tennessee area visiting the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, we're in Sevierville, Tennessee, right before you get to the Smokies. We're inside of Smoky Mountain Knife Works. Just walk in, head downstairs. You won't miss us. We've got a website, therelicroom.com, or just Google Smoky Mountain Relic Room, and you can find out more information than you ever want to know. And if you want to get a hold of me, just look up Chase Pipes on Facebook.
Indeed. And brother, I tell you what, I know your name, I know your number. So expect to hear from me, expect to hear from Jason and James too. We look forward to the next adventure. It's always a pleasure being out there visiting with you. And man, here's to more of them in the future, okay?
Yeah, I love it, man. Love what you guys do. Thank you guys for existing. I'm grateful. Remember, history rocks. Woo!
Yes, again, special thanks to Chase Pipes. And again, we appreciate him. That guy, his energy is fantastic, isn't it, guys?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I always tell people you're not going to find anybody, and I mean anybody, more passionate about history than Chase. I mean, he's the king of passion when it comes to history. And not only does he, participate in it, he literally lives it. Having spent time with him, we know for a fact that he was definitely born in the wrong century. He lives and loves everything about history.
Yes, he certainly does. And whether it's books, whether it's gemstones, and things like that, or historical objects, from his own family or things that he's collected from over the years, he's very passionate about getting that out there, educating the public, doing it right, and making the world a better place through the knowledge of our past. So we thank him very much. Look, guys, we've got a great conversation to get into here with Dr. C. Riley Augé about the archaeology of magic. Now, there have been some books written about this topic over the years. There has been some research, but I don't think anything to the extent and the depth that Dr. Augé brings to this subject. So it's about time, after this, for us to go after dark on this special edition of the Seven Ages audio journal with our guest, C. Riley Augé, and the Archaeology of Magic, right after this. Dr. C. Riley Augé is the University of Montana's Anthropological Collections Facility Curator and instructor of several archaeology and cultural anthropology courses such as Myth, Ritual, and Religion. She specializes in anthropological and archaeological study of belief systems, where her research and international publications emphasize the emotive and sensorial aspects of ritual behaviors and religious and magical beliefs. She was awarded the Society for Historical Archaeology 2016 Kathleen Kirk Gilmore Dissertation Award for her work on gendered magic, which is the basis for her new book, and it's a fascinating book indeed, The Archaeology of Magic, Gender and Domestic Protection in 17th-Century New England. So first and foremost, Dr. Augé, thank you for joining us here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you. It's an absolute thrill to be here and to have a chat about this fabulous topic.
It is a fabulous topic. I've certainly enjoyed your work with this, and we have lots of questions for you. Now, the archaeology of magic looks primarily, as noted there in your introduction, at British colonists in 17th century New England, although I think it applies, of course, broadly as far as archaeology and historical archaeology goes. But you look specifically at magical practices, also gender roles in relation to that. What prompted you to focus on that area and this period in history with your latest work?
Well, first of all, why this particular group of people, why this demographic? It really is because I was kind of frustrated and somewhat irritated at the lack of consideration of Anglo-European peoples as being believers in and users of magic. Virtually all study of magic in the archaeological field has been focused on what we call in anthropology the exotic other. So you can find lots of studies that very openly and enthusiastically talk about the use of magic in African American contexts or in Chinese settings. Certainly, magic has always been considered a very valid topic for archaeologists looking at ancient peoples and peoples in the far reaches of the world. But of course, the ridiculous Enlightenment notion that Anglo-Europeans as of the late 17th and early 18th centuries had eschewed all of that ridiculous superstitious nonsense, and we have become civilized and intelligent people, unlike everybody else, has had a ridiculously impactful and negative effect on the idea of us being allowed even to consider using magic or thinking about the use of magic in Anglo-European settings. And so I said, wait a minute, folks, all peoples have and continue to use magic and have this magical mindset. And so we need to be equilateral in our look at the way that people use these kind of belief systems. And so I said, okay, I'm going to show everyone that use of magic by Anglo-European peoples is just as important and prevalent as any other cultural group. So focusing on that particular demographic, I figured the place that I would be able to find the most documented information and evidence would be focused around the 17th century and specifically around Salem witch trials, and not just Salem, but certainly witch trials were held throughout the colonies. And so basically as a matter of expediency and the largest sample size, I assumed it was going to be the easy access to those kinds of documents and physical evidence would come from a time period when we knew for certain that people were very much engaged in the belief in witches and demons and tried to do whatever they could to protect themselves in those cases. And so hence the time period and the place.
Yes, you purposely focused on that. And of course, New England, as you note in the book, experienced high occurrence of witchcraft-related events. That might seem like an obvious place to focus on account of that, but also I think it's interesting that you find so much evidence of ritual practice and magical belief in that area on account of the fact that, the idea that the Salem witch trials had been the Puritan belief that this was evil and that this was not something that was acceptable in society. So to me, it really was quite interesting that your focus on that area, that period, that region shows so much. It really actually bespeaks a slightly different cultural attitude maybe and archaeological evidence in support of that than what most would know from a cursory look at history. Would you agree?
I would, because we've had this mistaken idea that if you are or were so devoutly religious that you wouldn't be practicing things like magic that we associate with evil and the devil. When the reality was that there's a very fuzzy line really between what was considered demonic magic and natural magic. And so just like today, people back then put the spin on whatever they believed in order to justify their beliefs and actions. And they did the same with magic. So if you could show that using particular things like horseshoes or certain plants that you could associate with mention in the Bible, then you could get away with saying, well, this is a godly and holy thing to do. I'm protecting myself and my family from the devil. I'm not in cahoots with the devil. But then again, you also had the people who didn't buy into that and said, no, all magic is related to the devil. You're being misled. And so, it's a really interesting, complicated and contradictory sort of belief system. But again, we just assume that, hey, if you're devoutly religious, you wouldn't have anything to do with magic. But that's not really the way it works.
Right. It's often a little more nuanced than that.
Yeah, as we begin to, define the conversation and look at the parameters for this type of undertaking tonight, something very unique that I found was the beginning of the book. You talk about the archaeologist Ralph Merrifield, and he observed, as I quote from the book, quote, "Ritual and magic were formerly part of everyday life, but by association with fantasy fiction and occultism, they have now acquired an aura of sensationalism that has discouraged investigation. So like all human activities, ritual customs intended to gain or avert disaster by supernatural means have left their mark on the archaeological record," end quote. And so there we begin to see some of the struggle, I guess you could say, of finding archaeology within a topic that is normally considered outside of normal archaeological bounds and means, if you will. So as we look into this, something that is so in depth talked about often, witchcraft trials and things of that nature. There's plenty of books that have been written, plenty of documentaries that have been made, but why is it the archaeology that is missing from those topics? So why so much attention on witchcraft itself, but so little on the quest for the archaeological remains of that?
That really goes back to the era of the new archaeology, all of the theoretical stances that tried to situate archaeology firmly within the sciences. And basically, their argument was that magic and any kind of belief was beyond the realm of archaeology. You couldn't actually find hard evidence and replicable evidence to support any of those kinds of interpretations. It wasn't until, of course, folks came along with post-processualism and said, no. Archaeological results and evidence don't have to be replicable, as in scientific experiments. And it was from that first opening in the late 80s, and Ralph Merrifield, of course, 1987. So the late 80s and early into the 90s is when archaeologists started to accept that not all archaeological evidence has to be quantifiable, bean counting, and that certainly it is valid to look at people's thoughts and obviously their symbols and ideology. And so we are still somewhat in that lag. Certainly religion got picked up a little earlier than magic. Magic has still just had kind of this bad rap, a superstitious fringe sort of idea. But amazingly now, over the last probably about 8 to 10 years, this field, the focus on magic has just exploded literally in archaeology studies all around the world. And because people are recognizing what Ralph Merrifield said all those decades ago, that magic really was just an integral part of everybody's everyday life, whether they recognized that or not. And if we're supposed to be figuring out what past life and past peoples were all about as archaeologists, then we certainly need to stop ignoring this particular aspect.
Yeah. Again, I love the discussion and the debate about Louis Benford, the transition between the different stages in archaeology, in the processual period and post-processual. But again, we do have to kind of check ourselves at times and see that despite the merit of looking at archaeology more scientifically with the analytical archaeological component on up into the 1980s, it's a fascinating discussion, but we have to kind of remind ourselves too that when we're looking at the past in the absence of an actual time machine, everything that we're doing, I mean, has to kind of be, you know, what we can learn from what was left behind. I mean, that is the essence of archaeology. And we have to actually just look at it for what it is in the context. And again, I think that as far as historical archaeology, which is what's so important about your book, Doctor, we have not only the archaeological component, but also we have some written texts that give us an even better idea that helps us infer what was really happening. And it's a very unique picture that emerges. Now, you know, I wanted to also get into some of the criteria that you use for identifying magic in archaeological contexts. Maybe we'll go ahead and do this now. 3 that you outline in later portions of the book, but which I think are important to discuss right now, are spatial orientation, materiality, and ideological concepts. Can we go over those 3, please?
Oh, absolutely. Okay. Spatial orientation is exceptionally important when you're trying to determine if what you're looking at could have been a magical expression, because so many things were just everyday objects. So when that object is found in a setting, and specifically they're found in what we call threshold settings, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a minute.
Sure.
But when particular objects are found outside of their normal use context, that should raise a red flag. And when those contexts are specifically thresholds, which are any kind of a demarcating place, so around doorways, around windows, in chimneys and hearths, around the perimeter of a building, and especially in the corners. The same goes for a larger tract of land, so along the edges of a crop field, or around the edges of a corral or stable areas. So anytime you have this interface space between where animals or crops or people would be versus the other side of that where danger can run amok, those threshold spaces are where people would apply magical applications. And so you find the horseshoe is such a simple example, but it's so classic. When you put that horseshoe on your door, or you bury it in your cellar, or you embed it in the walls of your buildings, your stables, or whatever, obviously that is out of its working context.
Right.
And so it's associated with the threshold. It's out of its normal context. That tells you this is most likely a magical application. Materiality, the second one, there are particular materials that people, and again, just not in New England, but truly around the world, almost universal concepts. There are particular materials that people have always believed innately have some kind of cosmic supernatural power. Metal is one of those, particularly iron. Mm-hmm. And the theory from that is that maybe it was because early iron, the encounter with early iron was from meteors, something falling out of the sky, mm-hmm. So falling out of the heavens. But iron, in any kind of form, it doesn't make any difference what is formed out of the iron. It's the fact that it's iron. But also precious metals, gold, silver, copper, those as well are believed to have this innate power that is placed there, created there by God. And so using those materials in any context, even in its most utilitarian, people knew that it had this added divine power already embedded in it. So, okay, you've got big iron bolts on your door that are functioning as iron bolts. But because they are iron, they are also magically protecting the door. So you've got these layers of belief going on because of the materiality. There are certain kinds of wood that were believed to, again, be divinely, magically endowed with particular protective elements. So the wood from yew trees and oak trees, hazel trees. And so those would be used to specifically build the thresholds and the door jambs and the hearth mantles. So again, in coffins, another one. So yes, it's utilitarian, but it's the materiality rather than its spatial orientation that is now giving it this material or magical aspect.
Uh-huh.
The last one, the ideology, and there's an entire chapter in the book where I give an example of that about numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Within religious doctrine and people's worldview, so, the worldview is truly a complex and comprehensive understanding of all the workings of the universe. So what is possible and what is not possible. And all of the connections between things. People can almost never articulate their worldview because it's so complicated and has all of these different elements. But one of the things that does get iterated are these connections between numbers, for example, and other kinds of ideological concepts. So 3, the most universally powerful number, 3 in every religion is associated with the Godhead, with the divine. And so as long as you have even that basic connection, you can now use that number 3 in a multiplicity of ways. And every time you do that, that underlying ideology of the Godhead is going to be an aspect that you just sometimes even take for granted because there's that immediate connection. And so the 3 is protecting you, whether it's, 3 strands of yarn that you've tied to your horse's mane, or saying your prayers 3 times, or whatever you do with the number 3, it is infused with this other ideological power that once again gets manifested into objects that we can recognize and associate with people believing and practicing magic.
Yeah, and thank you for that wonderful breakdown. Again, those elements I think are integral really to this discussion and very important in terms of the commonality, really, that these elements I think definitely apply to areas in other parts of the world and other traditions and other cultures. James, I believe you have a question. Jump in there.
Yeah, so I've been thinking of a way to sort of ask this question without asking it maybe in the wrong way, but for the layperson out there and strictly from an academic sense, what is the fundamental difference between magical practice and religious practice, especially when when we're referring to maybe Anglo-Saxon traditions?
That is an ongoing debate in anthropology. We have, for a very long time, divided the two, elevated religion and denigrated magic. The way that it had been divided, which of course we were struggling to get beyond that, but the initial differentiation had to do with religion focused on some kind of a divine being and was a group collaborative worship of this divine being, and there was a reciprocal kind of relationship in some way between that Godhead and the people. Magic was seen as a personal way to attempt to manipulate some kind of supernatural power, whether it came from the divine forces or from demonic forces, but it was a personal attempt to manipulate those forces for one's own personal gain. So while that for quite a long time was kind of considered the difference between magic and religion, most serious academics now don't really buy into that, because virtually all religious practice, when you really break it down, is based on the same kind of thinking, what we call, the magical mindset that involves magic. It's almost impossible, I think, to have religion without magic. You can have magic without religion, but not religion without magic. They both, of course, rely on the worldview that there are forces beyond human beings, beyond the mundane world, and those forces are connected. So the manipulation of one aspect is going to affect some other aspect. Catholicism is a really great example in this connection. For example, looking at the idea of relics. So if you were to possess some saint's bones or the piece of the cross or a piece of cloth from the Virgin Mary's robe, just having those objects that once were in association or were a part of that previous being, their force, their supernatural force still lives on and has power that can be applied and appropriated in some way by the worshipers. That's magic. That's the whole premise of magic, that all things contain some kind of connective power to everything that they've been in contact with, and that power lives on.
Fascinating.
I don't know if I've answered your question very well. It's a very complicated thing to try to separate these two concepts.
Certainly. And yes, it is a highly nuanced discussion, but one that's integral to understanding what we're talking about here. And allow me to remind the listener, of course, we are discussing the archaeology of magic. Our guest, Dr. C. Riley Augé. Jason?
Yeah, and as we begin to find commonalities, whether it be in magic or whether it be in religion, there's something that you touched on at the beginning of the book that I found really fascinating because it's applicable to both religion and magic, as we're discussing here tonight. And that is the dimension of fear. So really, when we stop and think about the human experience, whether it's religion or magic, so much of that at the core is driven by a fear of judgment, a fear of security, a fear of whatever it may be, whether it's a physical fear or whether it's a spiritual or emotional fear. So as we get into the why of the magic, I want to talk about the archaeology of anxiety and how that played into the writing of the book.
When I saw that book, the Archaeology of Anxiety, I probably jumped out of my chair and, did 3 somersaults. It was the first time that a publication had actually been put together focused on this notion of anxiety and fear as being something that archaeologists could actually look at and find material evidence for. And you're absolutely right. Fear is one of the basic, the primal emotions that human beings have. There are, different numbers, anywhere from 7 to 10 have been identified, but whatever the combination of those things are, fear is always one of the major ones in the list. And of course, it doesn't make any difference where you are, what time period you live in, what your circumstances are. Human beings always experience anxiety and fear. What we look for as human beings is some kind of stability, some kind of equilibrium to lessen that fear or anxiety so that we can be productive human beings. If we didn't, we would just be, a bunch of nutcases, and the whole world would collapse because we would give in to all of these fears that certainly surround everybody. And so what we do as human beings is find different coping mechanisms. We find different ways to frame those anxieties and those fears. One of those coping mechanisms is to, of course, create these beliefs that certain objects or certain behaviors, magic, if you will actually eliminate whatever the source of that fear is, or at least let us control the source of that fear. And once we feel empowered to overcome, in whatever way that is, either through elimination or just management of those external fears, then we can get on with business. We can get on with life. And, obviously there are setbacks, and then we reframe, and, maybe we need to refresh that magical amulet that we buried under the door, or, we need to get some fresh garlic, or replant those wreaths on our rooftop, or whatever our magical thing is. So fear, I found, was really the key. And when I saw that the Archaeology of Anxiety book, it really set me on the right path, because just generally looking for objects that are used magically and trying to understand, make that connection to gender and who used what, when, and why, those answers weren't coming to the fore until I stopped to think about, wait a minute, what is really the foundation here? Why are people using these objects? Why do they believe in magic? Number one, to alleviate their anxieties and their fears. What are those fears? And that's really what set me on the path to being able to find the right kinds of information, analyze both the documentary information as well as the archaeological evidence, and tease that out. What were men doing? What were women doing? How did gender play into this? Because there are different fears associated with different kinds of life experiences.
Yeah, and that's a perfect place to pick up. Fear and belief are some of the most powerful things in everyone's life, I believe. But when it comes to gender, which is at the heart of this book that you've written so masterfully, it is a fantastic volume that you've put together, but gender is at the heart of that. And so from the archaeological perspective, how do we begin to sort out these magical items or these magical practices, and how do you associate those back to a particular gender?
The first thing that is necessary is to truly understand what the gender constructs of a particular time period were. So you can't just jump in and start looking for magic and then associating it with particular gendered groups without understanding what their concepts of gender were. That was relatively straightforward with this particular demographic, because the Puritans were very, very explicit in their gender expectations and not just expectations, but requirements. They wrote multiple treatises, and preachers preached, hellfire kinds of sermons about the appropriate behavior of men and women. There were laws, and these folks were an incredibly litigious group. So we have all these court documents where both men and women were being dragged to court for misspeaking. Men weren't speaking like men were supposed to, or women weren't speaking like they were supposed to. And so I was really fortunate that there were so many documents that explicitly defined what these gender roles were. So based on that, I could then start to tease out, okay, well, if this is what it meant to be a woman or a man in this society, and there was a tremendous amount of anxiety about being able to uphold those expectations and be viewed by the rest of the community as a worthy and productive member of that community based on these gender roles. Obviously, there's some anxiety related there. So what might you do in order to protect yourself from not being able to fulfill those things? And one very direct issue that came out, and again, people actually talked about these kinds of things in different kinds of documents. This sounds pretty simplistic, but it was a major concern. If women could not make butter, consistently make good butter, then those women were not deemed to be successful wives. And truly being a wife was a woman's wife and mother was what a woman was supposed to do in life. And if you could not fulfill those basic roles, then there was something wrong with you. And one of those kind of standards or benchmarks that was used to determine your worth in fulfilling that role was whether you could make consistently good butter.
Isn't that remarkable?
It's
just remarkable.
And we might say, well, why butter? Well, butter was actually one of their main sources of protein. Mm-hmm. They actually ate more butter and dairy products than they did meat, red meat. We have this, weird vision. I think that they were eating lots of meat, wild game and stuff, but they weren't. So butter was this important element. There are so many magical charms and objects associated with butter churns that were meant to protect witches from getting in and spoiling the butter. So if butter didn't actually, or the cream didn't turn into butter, it was believed that a witch had, a person had bewitched the milk, and that was what was preventing it from turning into butter. So a woman would nail a whole, like a naturally whole stone or a dime, any kind of piece of metal would be attached to the butter churn. The butter churns themselves were made out of a particular wood that was believed to be protective. They would put certain plants around the churn itself. I mean, they did all kinds of applications to protect that. So this is a great example of how we can look at those sort of applications and say, a woman did that because she was afraid of her butter being bewitched. Men were mostly afraid, and again, they talked about this, they were mostly afraid of not being able to provide for their families, which again was the standard. To measure a man's worth, could he not only feed and provide shelter for his living family, but establish an estate, basically, to pass on to his sons. And if he couldn't do that, then once again, he is not considered a worthy man. He has failed as a man. And so the things that would allow him to be prosperous would be showing his success as a businessman, a farmer, someone who raised livestock, whatever his income producing business was, he needed to do that successfully. And of course, for these early New Englanders, most of them were farmers, very little kind of commerce. But the farming then allows us to see how they used magic mostly around their fields and their livestock. So again, we can start making these connections by going back again to materiality, spatial orientation, ideology, and all connecting that to gender. What kind of objects would men and women most likely be using? And how did that relate to them fulfilling their gender and societal roles? And in what cases would those things then need to be used as a protective object to safeguard themselves and their property and hence their roles in society?
That is very, very interesting. And as you were explaining that, I started to wonder if some of those protective objects, like you talked about with protecting the butter from bewitching or some of the other things, have those things survived in some form down into modern times where people use these types of things in their daily life, like a rabbit's foot, or an athlete has a pair of lucky socks, or something along those lines?
It's exactly the same thing. And in fact, there's a great article written by a fellow named George Milch. He wrote The Magic of Baseball, where he is specifically looking at athletes and baseball in particular, but other studies have also come along that basically support his findings. And any kind of undertaking, and especially athletics, that have a chanciness to them, a riskiness, so that there's not an absolute guarantee that you're going to win. You can obviously be prepared, but as we all know, sports are never predictable. And so in those unpredictable kinds of occupations, you actually find higher percentage of people who overtly use magical things like the lucky socks or the rabbit's foot, or they go through little, baseballers are famous, of course, for all of their little gyrations, their little gestures and rituals before they toss the ball or go to bat or whatever. And we see the same thing in other kinds of occupations as well. And this is true historically. Sailors were probably one of the most obvious groups that used magical objects on ships, because of course, the sailing, whaling, fishing, any of those kinds of occupations that took you out on that dangerous ocean were highly, highly unpredictable and dangerous. And we see sailors using lots and lots of magical objects that, of course, we can find those, but we still see those same ideas in those dangerous occupations.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And as someone who's spent over 6 years at sea, I can tell you that those little charms, even tattoos that you ritually put upon your body, definitely come into play in your daily life, that's for sure. As we begin to look further into the term magic and the way that I think a lot of people think of it as a primitive practice, something that used to go on, but yet everyone has a degree of ritual in their life, certain things that they do, certain things that they say in order to evoke something on the other side, something that influences their life. But I think a lot of people today don't realize that magic is still very prevalent throughout the world. As you get further into the book, the second chapter, The Nature of Magic, we begin with a discussion of that exact thing that we're talking about. Magic has its place throughout the world. And, to look at the book, it discusses how even today, throughout many cultures throughout the world, magic is a daily part of everyday life. So when we look at it internationally, if you will, discuss a little bit of how magic still is, to this day, a big part of many people's lives throughout the world.
Okay. It's one of those things that really can run a spectrum from the very simplest little uses of magic that, well, you were talking about the lucky socks. Being a university professor, of course, I deal with a lot of students who won't take that final exam unless they're using their lucky pen. Otherwise, they're going to fail. And so we see magic that's still being used and it's pervasive in these very simple ways. But at the other end of that spectrum, you, I'm sure, have seen over the last few years the really disturbing news stories about the belief in witchcraft and children being accused of being witches and being either mutilated or outright murdered in several countries in the world.
Yes.
So, magic is not something to be taken lightly. For people who believe in this force, it truly is a matter of life and death in many cases. The idea that certain people have the evil eye is still very, very prevalent throughout the Mediterranean area and the Middle East, to the point where, again, people can be ostracized from their society all the way to being murdered, executed for casting the evil eye, which is, again, a belief in a type of evil magic, that people have this power to harm and manipulate other people. So it's important that more people understand that magical thinking is not some kind of primitive, out-of-date, superstitious something from the past. Neurobiologists have actually been studying for several years now why it is that so many people make these connections between things, magically connecting things, and they have pretty much decided that it is just the way that human beings are hardwired. All human beings think this way to, a varying degree. The idea that we associate things with either the time and place that they occurred or with the person that they were once associated with, and that they continue to carry whatever kind of power, that at its most basic, that is magical thinking. And I'll give you a really simple example of that people would never, ever say, oh my God, that's magic. When a loved one dies, we often keep an object or a piece of clothing that belonged to that person. And when we hold that object, or for example, I have a sweater from my father's who died 10 years ago. And all I have to do is put that sweater on and I feel that he is there. So when we keep these objects that belong to that deceased person and we feel that there is some essence of that person being communicated to us through that object, that is magical thinking. It's called sympathetic magic. The idea that the essence of whatever the person or could even be an animal, the essence of the entity that owned that object lives on through the object, even though the person is no longer there. And that basic thinking is part of all human thought process. And so even though people don't recognize that as magical belief, it is. So, we can talk about these very overt and horrible situations about the murdering of children accused of being witches, all the way down to the kind of trivial laugh it off, the guy can't play baseball without his lucky socks. But that entire spectrum is magical thinking that we all have inherited from, the earliest human beings.
So I have to share kind of a personal note on that. I definitely have participated in that personal kind of a magic type of a thing with material objects. And my example is I'm retired from the Army, and my dad and my grandfather both were also in the Army, and I have a couple of objects that were passed down to me as good luck objects to take into combat. And one was a small Bible from my grandfather that he carried with him, and the other one was just this kind of a cheap Buddha necklace that my dad had picked up in Vietnam that he thought was a good luck charm. Both of these things, and I carried them with me everywhere I went when I was deployed overseas. And I knew, as a professional scientist, I knew there's no real scientific basis in that. However, I felt like it probably doesn't hurt. So I'll take all the luck I can get on that.
That's fascinating to me. Again, James in the unique position of being a professional scientist, but also someone who recognizes not only the spiritual potential having been handed down these quote-unquote artifacts from a deceased loved one, a direct family member, but of course also recognizing that your father had also imbued this same sort of potential, this magical potential to them. Dr. Augé, again, this seems to really bespeak the fact that psychologically, and you touched on this earlier, humans seem to need, to an extent, this sort of ritual for good or for ill. They seem to need it, don't they?
Yes, they do. And again, it really comes down to we live and always have, again, I'm talking about the entire spectrum of human existence. We have always lived in a dangerous and unpredictable world. And even in the safest context, we can't know everything. And so we always think of something. We have perceived dangers. We always think of something that's unknown that creates anxiety. And so in order to really give ourselves this sense of stability and empowerment, we need to be able to manifest something that we can project that onto, project both the fear and the idea that we can control whatever those fears are. And when we do that, we truly do empower ourselves. So it really doesn't make any difference whether those things truly work, whether there really is magical power out there or not. It's if we believe they work. It's the perception that they work that is important. And we cling on to that. It's a simple little thing, and we cling on to it, and there we go. I did an outreach a few years ago to a high school class talking about the archaeology of magic. And one of the students, a little freshman, said, "Doctor, do you believe in magic?" And I said, "You know what? I believe in the power of magic." And I think that's all that it really is. It doesn't matter whether, or, it's not like we're here to prove that magic exists. What we're here to do is to understand how these beliefs actually enabled people to get on with their lives and be successful. It also, of course, helps us understand those times where it got out of control, like the witchcraft trials and those kinds of settings.
Yeah, absolutely. I've often heard it said that it doesn't matter if you believe in magic. It only matters if the practitioner believes in magic. And therefore, they're willing to do things above and beyond what someone else would do because they believe that there will be an effect from the things that they're participating in, whether it be magical ritual, casting of spells, whatever it is. They believe that it's going to work, and therefore they'll do things, actionable things in life in order to accomplish that. So I think both sides of it are completely fascinating. But as we're nearing the end here, I just want to make sure that we actually get into some of the archaeology itself and discuss, as someone looking at the archaeology of magic, how is it through an excavation process? How is it that we're actually finding items, and how are they most often found?
Great question. So the number one key, of course, and I mentioned this in the book, is to be aware. So to understand and to be aware of magical practice, and especially what we were talking about, the spatiality, the context, so that when you find you're excavating, let's say, around the footprint of a residence. So when you find objects that are located, iron objects, broken, bent, intentionally embedded objects in the footprint or the fabric of the building, you aren't just dismissing them as, oh, well, that's an anomaly, or that's kind of weird, or, putting the old label, oh, it must be ritual. Well, saying it must be ritual is the same thing as saying, I don't know what that is, and let's just, chalk it up under, well, that's a metal object, so we'll count it in the metal artifacts. So paying attention to where the objects are found and what they are, and at least documenting that information as detailed as you can, and not letting those objects just get lost and subsumed within the general catalog of, 49 pins or whatever it is, because that's how we lose any kind of interpretive understanding of the potentiality of magic. So it's being aware, really documenting the objects, and cataloging them in such a way that further researchers can come back and be able to make those interpretations if they're there. One of the things that, of course, happens is that not within an actual archaeological excavation, but in historical house renovations, or people not doing an official excavation, but maybe doing some improvement on their farmsteads or whatever. They start digging things up. Many of these objects are actually found by non-archaeologists in those kind of contexts. And of course, when house renovators or builders or developers or whatever find these things, most of them don't have any knowledge or understanding of what it is that they're actually finding. To them, it's either weird or it's just junk, and they throw it away. So that's one of the big issues, is trying to get the word out and to educate people, both archaeologists and these other professionals, but non-archaeologists, to the importance of what these objects are and what they can actually tell us, and to at least contact archaeologists to say, hey, we just found this mummified cat behind the chimney, so that we can start building a bigger database of all of these different examples, and therefore we can then continue to educate and build larger and larger sample sizes of this information.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, as someone who hails from Charleston, South Carolina myself, I'm very, very familiar with many of these items with the Gullah culture and various other types of people who've moved through this area throughout history. It's very rich in those type of objects. But just so the listeners get a clear understanding, if someone was renovating a house or they were looking at a farmstead that was being updated, what exactly are we looking at as far as magical objects, and how would they be recognized by someone who was just a layperson?
Some of them are very, very obvious. In most of those contexts, there would be something buried or embedded in the walls, often, again, around thresholds, around doors, windows, in the corners of the houses, in the cellar areas, around and inside the hearth and the chimney. And there's a pretty standard group of objects that are found frequently, one of which is shoes and boots. Most of them are children's, but we find lots of adult-sized shoes and boots as well. They're usually old, beat up, you know, sometimes they're even cut in half. So they're generally not shoes that are wearable anymore. And they were intentionally buried or hidden within or underneath the fabric of the house. So lots and lots of shoes. The other thing is animal parts, and specifically cats, dried cats. And sometimes, you know, a cat could crawl into a little space and die, but the cats that were intentionally concealed, we call them ICOs, intentionally concealed objects. The ones that were intentionally concealed, it's very obvious that there's no way that a cat could have just snuck in through some little crack or whatever and died and became mummified within the wall or the floorboards or the rafters. Oftentimes they're even posed, maybe with a rat or a mouse. So it looks like the cat is actually jumping on the rodent. We found, actually it was through kind of a combination archaeological and construction project. There's a huge construction project going on here in Missoula, Montana, where they were taking out an entire historic neighborhood to build a new library. And they had a couple of archaeology students from the university here actually go and kind of monitor what they were doing. And it happened to be a day that the students weren't on site, but the construction workers found a mummified cat underneath the subfloor of one of the houses. And again, it was in a situation where the cat couldn't possibly have just crawled there and died. And then later they found several other kinds of objects that were embedded along the thresholds. Again, there was a boot. There was a sharp metal object, which is the third category of things, sharp metal objects. This one happened to be a Civil War bayonet that was embedded underneath the door threshold, and a beat up old felt hat. So hats and shoes are kind of one category clothing. So this particular house had all of it. And we've now been able to preserve all of those things. We've named the cat Whiskers. It's a very cute little mummified cat. But so there are these pretty standard objects. And again, they are often in these threshold areas. You don't have to be an expert when you're pulling, those planks off the wall and you find a cache of old shoes or a cat, or horse skulls is another one that's relatively common. Besides the intentionally concealed objects, there are also symbols that these renovators and restorers often can't find. There are magical symbols that people scratched into the window panes on the glass. Circles are a very common one, and oftentimes 3 circles overlapping. They did the same thing with those overlapping circles that they carved into rafters and beams. If there's a fireplace, oftentimes around the fireplace, you will find these magical symbols scratched into the lintels and the support. There's some other kind of, well, they're less frequently found, but then again, people don't generally look for them because, or they don't recognize them when they see them. One is little teardrop shapes used or created rather by using a candle that's being held up to a rafter beam. And so they create these little teardrop burn marks. And oftentimes they are in groups of 3 or multiples of 3. So there are some pretty basic objects and symbols that people can find. And actually, I'm trying to start a database, kind of a clearinghouse, where anytime people find these things, they can just contact me and we can add it to the database, and then it can just keep building and building, and people could then go there and also say, hey, you know, I found this. Has anyone else found something similar?
Oh, that would be wonderful. And I understand also you're writing an archaeological field handbook too, right, on ritual, religion, and magic. Is that correct?
Yes. In fact, that's almost done. I'm sending it off to publishers here in the next month. That, I feel, is my magnum opus. It truly is a handbook. It's meant to be taken out into the field, but it's also meant for these, you know, non-archaeologists, renovators, and whoever might come across some of these things. And it does cover ritual, religion, and magic. Mm-hmm. And basically, it breaks down every conceivable type of setting and expression of these belief systems for all cultures, for all times, and all places.
Wow.
It's a pretty comprehensive work. And one of the things that I stress in that book, and this isn't something that we've actually touched much on in our conversation today, but when we use the word ritual, most people associate that with some kind of religious or at least a belief system associated with deities and that kind of thing. Ritual can be totally secular. And for those of you who have been in the military, you're very well aware of this. There are lots of military rituals that have got nothing to do with religious beliefs or even magical beliefs. So there are lots of secular rituals. There are political and academic and economic. I mean, even a parade, I'm thinking Macy's Day Parade, that's a ritual. So this manual goes into those kinds of ritualistic behaviors as well.
Wow. I tell you, that's going to be on our reading list. And I think that just about wraps everything up. There is so much that we could discuss. And on account of how much more there is, really, I have to drive people's attention over yet again to the Archaeology of Magic, Gender and Domestic Protection in 17th-Century New England. And, of course, that forthcoming handbook, like I mentioned, we will certainly be on the lookout for. But, Dr. Augé, I want to thank you yet again for being our guest tonight. It has truly been a fascinating discussion here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.
Thank you so much. This has really been a treat.
Special thanks again to C. Riley Augé for joining us for this fascinating discussion about the magic of archaeology. Now, I said earlier that archaeology is magical, but I think Dr. Augé takes this to an all-new level. Please support her work. Check out her book. We'll have all of that linked in the show notes for this special episode, this After Dark episode of Seven Ages. Now, in the weeks and months to come, we also have some exciting archaeological sites that we're going to be discussing, all kinds of good things to talk about. I'm not going to say too much more right now. I just want to remind everybody out there, the best is yet to come. And so please support us. If you see our posts online, on Facebook or on Twitter or on YouTube or wherever, consider sharing those. Tell people about the show if you enjoy it. And of course, also, we accept donations. If you would like to send along a small amount in support of the research that we do, the trips that we do, the coffee we have to drink in order to get through all of these papers and these books and publications that we copiously study in advance of interviews with fantastic experts like Dr. Augé, you can help us out in that way too. And of course, don't forget that all of our podcasts and other content are available online at sevenages.org. Well, fellas, it's already after dark, but I say maybe if we have time, let's just enjoy one more round over here as we pony up at the Cross-Tyme Pub, like we do at the end of every episode. Oh, and one more thing, too. Don't forget, folks, you'll find the Seven Ages team on Chase Pipe's podcast, Chasing History. Just go on YouTube, look for Chasing History. So if you enjoy this podcast, please check out Chase's show. He was kind enough to interview us there. And after all that talking, guys, I think it's time for another round. What do you say?
Yeah, I say so. So archaeology is magical, but so is last call.
I agree. Well, then, on that note, gentlemen, and on behalf of Jason Pintrail, environmental scientist, James Waldo, geologist extraordinaire, and yours truly, your resident history enthusiast, Micah Hanks, we are the Seven Ages Research Associates. We appreciate you guys for being here, for liking, for rating and reviewing us, and of course, as always, for keeping up with us in our adventures. We will see you next time as we continue our pursuit of answers about human history and the ancient past right here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal.